The summer heat pressed down on the crowded beach bar like a heavy blanket, making everyone irritable and short-tempered. The smell of sunscreen mixed with beer and fried food hung thick in the air as tourists and locals mingled in the late afternoon chaos. Sarah Martinez sat quietly at the end of the bar, nursing a cold water bottle and watching the ocean waves crash against the shore through the open windows. She had come here to decompress after months of intense training, seeking nothing more than peace and solitude. At 28, Sarah carried herself with a quiet confidence that most people mistook for shyness. Her athletic build was hidden beneath a loose-fitting sundress, and her sun-streaked brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. To anyone watching, she looked like just another tourist enjoying a quiet drink. What they couldn't see were the calluses on her hands from rope climbing, the barely visible scars from countless training exercises, or the way her eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloging exits and potential threats without conscious thought. Sarah had spent the last 6 years as a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women to ever complete the grueling training program. She had served 3 tours overseas, leading rescue missions in hostile territory and training local forces in counter-terrorism tactics. Her teammates called her Ghost because of her ability to move silently through any environment, appearing and disappearing like smoke. But here, in this crowded bar, she was just Sarah, trying to enjoy a rare moment of normalcy during her leave. The trouble started at the other end of the bar, where a group of college-aged men had been drinking heavily since noon. Their leader, a stocky guy named Derek Peterson, had the kind of aggressive swagger that came from too much alcohol and too little maturity. He wore an expensive polo shirt that strained against his beer gut, and his voice carried the entitled tone of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His friends laughed too loudly at his crude jokes and egged him on as his behavior grew increasingly inappropriate throughout the afternoon. Derek had been making comments about women all day, rating their appearance and making lewd suggestions loud enough for everyone to hear. The bartender, a college student named Miguel, had already asked them to keep it down twice, but Derek just laughed and ordered another round. His friends, equally intoxicated and eager to impress their self-appointed leader, continued to enable his increasingly aggressive behavior. As the afternoon wore on, Derek's attention turned to Sarah. He noticed her sitting alone and interpreted her quiet demeanor as weakness rather than preference for solitude. In his alcohol-clouded judgment, she seemed like an easy target for his particular brand of harassment. He nudged his friends and pointed in her direction, making comments about how she looked lonely and probably needed some company from a real man. Sarah was aware of the group's attention, but chose to ignore it, hoping they would lose interest and move on to something else. She had dealt with harassment before, both in civilian life and during her military career, and had learned that sometimes the best strategy was to avoid engagement altogether. She finished her water and was preparing to leave when Derek decided to make his move. Stumbling slightly, Derek approached Sarah with the exaggerated confidence of a drunk person trying to appear sober. His friends watched from their table, snickering and making comments just loud enough for Sarah to hear. The bar had grown quieter as other patrons sensed the tension building, conversations dying down as people turned their attention to the unfolding drama. "Hey there, beautiful," Derek slurred, sliding onto the bar stool next to Sarah without invitation. "You look lonely over here all by yourself. Why don't you come join me and my friends? We know how to show a lady a good time." Sarah turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "Thank you, but I'm fine here. I was actually just leaving." Her voice was steady and polite, but there was an underlying steel that most people would have recognized as a warning. Derek, however, was too intoxicated and too accustomed to getting his way to pick up on subtle cues. "Aw, come on," Derek pressed, moving closer and placing his hand on Sarah's arm. "Don't be like that. I'm trying to be nice here. The least you could do is be friendly back." His grip tightened slightly, and Sarah could smell the alcohol on his breath mixed with cheap cologne and sweat. Sarah looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. "Please remove your hand," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of authority that came from years of commanding respect in life-or-death situations. "I asked you politely to leave me alone." Derek's face flushed red, whether from alcohol or embarrassment at being turned down in front of his friends. His grip on her arm tightened further and his voice took on an ugly edge. Listen here, princess. I'm trying to be nice, but you're being a real bitch about it. Maybe you need someone to teach you some manners. The bar had gone completely silent now, with even the music seeming to fade into the background. Miguel, the bartender, reached for his phone to call security, but Derek's friends were already moving closer, forming a loose circle around Sarah and their leader. They had done this before, using their numbers to intimidate women into compliance, and they expected this situation to play out like all the others. Sarah remained perfectly still, her body language appearing calm and non-threatening. Years of tactical training had taught her to control her physical responses, to appear relaxed even when every muscle was coiled and ready for action. She assessed the situation quickly. 5 attackers, multiple civilians in the area, limited space to maneuver, and the need to de-escalate without causing unnecessary harm. I'm going to ask you one more time, Sarah said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Remove your hand and walk away. Derek laughed, a harsh sound that drew encouraging chuckles from his friends. Or what? What are you going to do about it, sweetheart? He stood up, using his size advantage to loom over her while maintaining his grip on her arm. Maybe I should teach you what happens to stuck-up bitches who don't know their place. What happened next would be talked about in that bar for years to come. In one fluid motion, Sarah stood and twisted Derek's arm in a way that anatomy was never intended to allow. The specific technique, called a standing armbar, was something she had practiced thousands of times in training and used successfully in combat situations. Derek's surprised yelp of pain cut through the silence as he found himself suddenly bent forward at an impossible angle, completely under Sarah's control. The first thing you should know, Sarah said conversationally, as if she was discussing the weather rather than potentially breaking someone's arm, is that when someone tells you to stop touching them, you stop. It's really that simple. Derek tried to struggle, but Sarah's grip was like iron, and any movement on his part only increased the pressure on his hyperextended joint. His friends stood frozen, unsure what to do in a situation they had never encountered before. They were used to their size and numbers giving them an automatic advantage, but something about Sarah's calm competence told them this wasn't going to be a typical confrontation. Now, Sarah continued, her voice still conversational, but carrying an unmistakable note of command, you're going to apologize to me and to everyone else in this bar for your behavior. Then you and your friends are going to leave quietly and not come back. Do we understand each other? Derek, his face contorted in pain and humiliation, tried to maintain his bravado. You crazy bitch, let go of me! Do you know who I am? My father. Sarah applied just enough additional pressure to cut off his threat mid-sentence. I don't care who your father is or what you think that entitles you to do. Right now, you're just a man who put his hands on someone without permission and threatened her when she said no. The only question is whether you're smart enough to learn from this experience. The standoff continued for several long seconds, with Derek's friends unsure whether to intervene, and the other bar patrons watching in fascination. Sarah maintained her hold effortlessly, her breathing steady and her expression calm. This was nothing compared to subduing armed combatants in hostile territory, and her military training had taught her to remain in complete control of both her emotions and the tactical situation. Finally, Derek's survival instincts overcame his pride. Okay, he gasped. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to everyone. Just let me go, please. Sarah studied his face for a moment, reading his body language for signs of deception or continued aggression. Satisfied that he was genuinely cowed, she released her hold and stepped back, positioning herself where she could watch both Derek and his friends while maintaining easy access to multiple exit routes. Derek stumbled backward, clutching his arm and staring at Sarah with a mixture of pain, confusion, and growing anger. The humiliation of being overpowered by someone half his size, especially in front of his friends and the bar full of witnesses, was eating at him like acid. His friends gathered around him, unsure whether to help him or maintain their distance from this woman who had just demonstrated capabilities they didn't understand. That was your free lesson, Sarah said, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to having her orders followed without question. If there's a next time, the consequences will be much more severe. I suggest you take some time to think about how you treat people and whether your current approach is really working out for you. Derek's face cycled through several different expressions as his alcohol-impaired brain tried to process what had just happened. The pain in his arm was real enough, but the damage to his ego was even worse. He had built his identity around being the alpha male, the guy who could intimidate anyone smaller or weaker than himself. Having that image shattered by a woman in a sundress was more than his fragile masculinity could handle. "This isn't over," Derek snarled, though he made no move to approach Sarah again. "Nobody humiliates me like that and gets away with it. Nobody." Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same clinical detachment she might use to assess a potential security threat. "Is that supposed to be some kind of threat?" she asked. "Because if it is, you should probably think very carefully about your next move. You've already demonstrated that you can't handle me one-on-one. Do you really want to escalate this situation further?" The challenge hung in the air between them, and Derek's friends shifted uncomfortably as they realized their leader was about to make a decision that could have serious consequences for all of them. The rational part of Derek's mind, what little was left functioning after hours of heavy drinking, urged him to cut his losses and walk away. But his wounded pride and his need to reassert dominance in front of his peers drove him toward a much more dangerous choice. What Derek didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sarah's calm confidence wasn't just the result of self-defense training or natural athletic ability. She was a graduate of one of the most demanding military programs in the world, trained to handle threats far more serious than drunk college students in a beach bar. Her skills had been forged in real combat situations where failure meant death, not just embarrassment. As Derek weighed his options, Sarah waited patiently. Her posture relaxed but ready. She hoped he would choose to walk away, not because she feared the confrontation, but because she understood that what came next would be far worse for him than what had already happened. She had given him every opportunity to de-escalate, shown him exactly what kind of person he was dealing with, and offered him a graceful way out of the situation. But some people, Sarah knew from hard experience, only learned lessons the hard way. Derek's wounded pride festered like an infected wound as he retreated to his table, nursing both his injured arm and his bruised ego. His friends gathered around him, their earlier bravado replaced by nervous uncertainty. They had never seen their leader so thoroughly dominated, especially not by someone who appeared so deceptively ordinary. The dynamic of their group, built entirely around Derek's supposed alpha status, had been shattered in the span of 30 seconds. "Dude, maybe we should just go," suggested Tommy, the youngest of the group. He was barely 21 and had been swept up in Derek's circle more by circumstance than choice. The display of violence, even controlled violence, had sobered him considerably. "That chick is obviously trained in something serious. This isn't worth getting arrested over." Derek shot him a withering look that could have melted steel. "Shut up, Tommy. Nobody asked for your opinion." He flexed his fingers experimentally, wincing at the lingering pain in his shoulder joint. The humiliation burned worse than the physical discomfort, and the fact that everyone in the bar was still staring at him only made it worse. "Some little girl thinks she can embarrass me in front of everyone? She has no idea who she's messing with." Meanwhile, Sarah had returned to her seat at the bar, though she remained alert to the continuing threat. Years of combat experience had taught her to recognize when a situation was truly resolved versus when it was simply paused. Derek's body language, the way he kept glancing in her direction, and the heated whispered conversation among his friends all indicated that this confrontation was far from over. Miguel, the bartender, approached her cautiously. "Miss, I called security, but they're dealing with something else right now. Maybe you should consider leaving. Those guys have been trouble all day, and Derek Peterson isn't the type to let something like this go." Sarah appreciated the young man's concern, but she also understood something he didn't. Leaving now would only delay the inevitable. Men like Derek didn't forget perceived slights, and they rarely learned from consequences that didn't fully penetrate their entitled worldview. If she left, he would likely follow or find another target for his aggression. Better to resolve the situation completely while she could control the variables. "I appreciate the warning," Sarah said quietly, "but I think I'll finish my water first. Sometimes bullies need to learn that there are consequences for their actions." Derek's friends were split between those urging caution and those encouraging him to reassert his dominance. Brad, his longtime best friend since high school, was firmly in the latter camp. He had built his own identity around being Derek's right-hand man, and seeing his leader humiliated threatened his position in their social hierarchy. "She got lucky with some kind of martial arts move," Brad insisted, his voice carrying the desperate conviction of someone trying to convince himself as much as others. "But there are 5 of us, and 1 of her. Numbers matter more than technique. We can't let her get away with this." Mike and Jason, the other 2 members of their group, exchanged uncertain glances. They were followers by nature, accustomed to letting Derek make decisions and going along with whatever he decided. But something about Sarah's calm competence had shaken their confidence in their usual approach to handling conflicts. "I don't know, man," Mike said hesitantly. "Did you see the way she moved? That wasn't lucky. That was professional. What if she's a cop or something?" Derek slammed his beer bottle down hard enough to slosh foam across the table. "I don't care if she's a cop, a Marine, or the damn Queen of England. Nobody treats me like that and walks away laughing about it. We're going to show her what happens when you mess with the wrong people." The alcohol in Derek's system was working against any rational thought processes he might have otherwise employed. His decision-making was further impaired by a lifetime of getting his way through intimidation and his father's money. Derek Peterson Sr. was a successful businessman who had spent his son's entire life buying his way out of consequences, teaching Derek that any problem could be solved with enough aggression or enough cash. What Derek had never encountered was someone like Sarah Martinez, who existed entirely outside the sphere of influence his family's wealth could touch. Sarah had earned her position through merit, survived situations where money and connections meant nothing, and developed a moral code that didn't bend to social pressure or physical intimidation. As the afternoon wore on, Derek's group continued drinking while planning their next move. Their conversation grew more heated and less coherent as they worked themselves up for another confrontation. Other bar patrons began to leave, sensing the tension and not wanting to be caught in the middle of whatever was brewing. Even Miguel was growing increasingly nervous, checking his phone repeatedly for any word from security. Sarah observed all of this while maintaining her relaxed posture at the bar. Her military training included extensive instruction in threat assessment and situational awareness, skills that served her well in civilian environments. She could read the group's body language like a tactical manual, predicting their likely moves and preparing appropriate responses. The second confrontation began when Derek stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. His friends followed suit, though with noticeably less enthusiasm than they had shown earlier. The alcohol had made them bolder but not smarter, and even through their impaired judgment, they could sense that they were making a serious mistake. "Hey!" Derek called out loudly, drawing the attention of everyone remaining in the bar. "You think you're pretty tough, don't you?" Sitting over there acting all cool like you're better than everyone else. Sarah turned slowly to face him, her expression neutral but alert. "I think I'm someone who wants to finish her drink in peace. Is there something specific you need, or are you just looking for more attention?" The casual dismissal in her tone hit Derek like a physical blow. Throughout his life, he had been accustomed to being the center of attention, the dominant personality in any room. Having someone treat him as inconsequential, especially after he had just suffered a public humiliation, was intolerable to his inflated ego. "You embarrassed me in front of my friends," Derek said, his voice rising with each word. "Nobody does that to Derek Peterson. Nobody. My family owns half this town, and I can make your life very difficult if I want to." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. The mention of using wealth and influence to intimidate someone struck a nerve that Derek couldn't have known existed. During her military service, Sarah had seen what happened when people with power used it to hurt those who couldn't fight back. The memory of villages destroyed by corrupt officials, of good people suffering because they couldn't pay bribes or buy protection, had shaped her understanding of justice in ways that Derek's privileged upbringing never could. "Is that supposed to scare me?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that Derek was too drunk and angry to recognize. "You're threatening to use Daddy's money because you can't handle being told no by a woman half your size. Do you have any idea how pathetic that sounds?" Derek's face flushed an even deeper red, and his friends moved closer behind him. The formation was instinctive, something they had done dozens of times when intimidating other people into backing down. What they didn't understand was that their approach, which relied entirely on superior numbers and the target's fear of escalation, was useless against someone who had been trained to handle multiple attackers in life-or-death situations. "I'm giving you one chance to apologize," Derek said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a menacing whisper. "Get on your knees and tell everyone here that you're sorry for disrespecting me, and maybe I'll let this slide." The demand was so outrageous, so completely divorced from reality, that several of the remaining bar patrons gasped audibly. Miguel reached for his phone again, this time to call the police directly, rather than waiting for security. Even Derek's friends looked uncomfortable with the escalation, though none of them were brave enough to challenge their leader directly. Sarah stood up slowly, her movements fluid and controlled. At her full height, she was still significantly smaller than Derek, but her presence seemed to fill the space around her. Years of command experience had taught her how to project authority that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with unshakable confidence. "Let me make sure I understand you correctly," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent bar. "You want me to get on my knees and apologize to you because you grabbed me without permission, I defended myself, and your feelings got hurt when it didn't work out the way you planned." Derek's jaw clenched as he realized how ridiculous his demand sounded when stated so clearly. But he had already committed to this course of action, and backing down now would mean accepting an even greater humiliation than he had already endured. His pride, inflated by years of unchallenged privilege, wouldn't allow him to de-escalate. "That's right," Derek said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "You need to learn some respect, and I'm going to be the one to teach it to you." Sarah nodded thoughtfully as if she was seriously considering his proposal. "I see. And what happens if I refuse? Are you planning to force me to my knees? Are your friends going to help you assault a woman because she hurt your feelings?" The direct questions cut through the alcohol-fueled bravado like a knife, forcing Derek and his friends to confront exactly what they were threatening to do. When stated so plainly, their intended actions sounded criminal rather than heroic, cowardly rather than dominant. The fantasy they had built in their minds, where they were the wronged parties seeking justified revenge, crumbled under the harsh light of Sarah's unwavering gaze. "You're damn right we will," Derek said, though his voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "There are 5 of us and 1 of you. You got lucky before, but luck runs out." Sarah's expression remained calm, but anyone watching closely would have noticed the subtle shift in her posture. Her weight shifted slightly to the balls of her feet, her hands moved to a more neutral position, and her breathing deepened almost imperceptibly. These were the automatic responses of someone whose body had been conditioned by thousands of hours of combat training, someone who could transition from conversation to violence in the blink of an eye. "You know what?" Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of resignation that Derek mistook for surrender. "You're right. There are 5 of you, and you probably could overpower me if you all attacked at once. But here's what you need to understand before you make that decision. I won't go down easy, and I won't go down quietly. Someone is going to get seriously hurt, and it probably won't be me." Derek's confidence wavered slightly at her matter-of-fact tone. Throughout his life, he had been accustomed to people backing down when faced with superior numbers. The few times someone had stood up to him, they had usually done so with bravado and empty threats that disguised their underlying fear. Sarah's calm acceptance of the tactical situation, combined with her confident prediction of the outcome, was unlike anything he had encountered before. "Are you threatening us?" Brad asked, trying to inject some authority into his voice. "Because that sounds like a threat to me." Sarah shook her head slowly. "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply explaining the reality of the situation you're about to create. If 5 grown men attack 1 woman in a crowded bar, someone is going to call the police. There are going to be witnesses, security cameras, and physical evidence. Even if you manage to hurt me, which is a much bigger if than you seem to think, you would all be facing serious criminal charges." The mention of criminal charges and police involvement sent a chill through Derek's friends that even the alcohol couldn't numb. They were college students and recent graduates with futures to consider, not hardened criminals willing to risk everything for Derek's wounded ego. The reality of potentially spending years in prison over a bar fight began to penetrate their alcohol-clouded judgment. But more importantly, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a conversational level that somehow seemed more ominous than shouting, you need to ask yourself if your pride is really worth what's going to happen to you. Because I can promise you, with absolute certainty, that attacking me is the worst decision you could possibly make right now. The conviction in her voice, the complete absence of fear or uncertainty, sent warning signals that even Derek's impaired judgment couldn't entirely ignore. But he had painted himself into a corner, made threats in front of witnesses, and built up an expectation among his friends that he would follow through. In his alcohol-addled mind, backing down now would mean accepting permanent humiliation and losing his position as the group's leader. What Derek couldn't understand, what his privileged upbringing had never taught him, was that real strength sometimes meant knowing when not to fight. Sarah's willingness to walk away from the first confrontation hadn't been weakness. It had been an attempt to spare him from consequences he wasn't prepared to face. Now, as he stood on the precipice of a decision that would change his life forever, Derek Peterson was about to discover just how wide the gap was between his inflated self-image and reality. The tension in the bar reached a breaking point as Derek made his fateful decision. His pride, wounded beyond repair by the earlier humiliation, demanded satisfaction, regardless of the consequences. With a roar of drunken rage, he lunged forward, his friends reluctantly following behind him, like sheep following their shepherd toward a cliff. What happened next unfolded with the kind of brutal efficiency that could only come from years of professional training in close-quarters combat. Sarah's response was immediate, precise, and devastating in its effectiveness. As Derek reached for her with both hands, she stepped into his attack, rather than away from it, using his momentum against him in a way that physics and leverage made inevitable. Her right hand shot forward in a palm strike that connected with Derek's solar plexus, driving all the air from his lungs and causing him to double over in agony. Before he could recover, Sarah's knee came up to meet his descending face with a sickening crack that echoed through the bar like a gunshot. Derek's nose exploded in a spray of blood, and he staggered backward, his hands instinctively moving to cover his ruined face. But Sarah wasn't finished. Years of training had taught her that in a multiple attacker scenario, you had to neutralize threats quickly and decisively, or you would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. As Derek stumbled away from her, she pivoted smoothly to face Brad, who was rushing toward her with his fists raised in a poor imitation of a boxer's stance. Brad had probably watched too many movies where bar fights involved slow, choreographed exchanges of haymaker punches. He had no training, no experience with real violence, and no understanding of what he was actually facing. Sarah's response was a textbook demonstration of military close combat techniques. A quick jab to his throat that collapsed his trachea temporarily, followed by a devastating hook to his liver that dropped him to his knees, gasping and retching. The entire sequence, from Derek's initial lunge to Brad hitting the floor, had taken less than 10 seconds. Tommy, Mike, and Jason froze in shock, their alcohol-impaired brains struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Two of their friends, including their supposedly invincible leader, had been neutralized so quickly and efficiently that it seemed almost supernatural. "Stop!" Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Think very carefully about your next move, because this is where it stops being self-defense and starts being assault on my part. I don't want to hurt anyone else, but I will if you force me to." Tommy, the youngest of the group, was the first to raise his hands in surrender. "I'm out," he said, his voice shaking with fear and adrenaline. "I don't want any part of this anymore." He backed away slowly, keeping his hands visible, his earlier concerns about getting arrested suddenly seeming very prescient. Mike and Jason looked at each other, then at their two friends on the ground, then back at Sarah. Whatever courage the alcohol had given them evaporated as they realized they were completely out of their depth. This wasn't the kind of bar fight they had imagined, where they could overwhelm someone with superior numbers and walk away with bruised knuckles and a good story. This was something else entirely, something professional and terrifying in its clinical precision. "We're done," Mike said, echoing Tommy's surrender. "We don't want any trouble." He moved to help Brad, who was still on his knees trying to breathe, while Jason went to Derek, who was sitting on the floor with blood streaming from his broken nose. Sarah watched them carefully, her body still coiled and ready for action, but she could see that the fight had gone out of them. Fear was a more effective teacher than pride, and they had just received a masterclass in the difference between movie violence and real-world combat effectiveness. Derek, despite his injuries, wasn't ready to accept defeat. Blood ran down his chin as he glared at Sarah with a mixture of pain, humiliation, and rage that bordered on the psychotic. His nose was clearly broken, and one of his front teeth was loose, but the physical damage was nothing compared to the destruction of his self-image. "You think this is over?" He spat, literally spitting blood as he spoke. "You have no idea who you're messing with. My father is Richard Peterson, owner of Peterson Development Group. We own half the real estate in this county, including this bar. I can have you arrested, sued, destroyed financially. I can ruin your entire life." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something cold and dangerous flickered in her eyes. Throughout her military career, she had encountered men like Derek's father, wealthy, powerful individuals who used their influence to exploit others and escape consequences for their actions. She had seen the damage such people could cause, the lives they could destroy with a phone call or a bribe. "Richard Peterson," Sarah repeated thoughtfully, as if she was searching her memory. "The same Richard Peterson who was investigated by the FBI 3 years ago for bribing city council members to approve his waterfront development project?" Derek's confident sneer faltered slightly. "Those charges were dropped," he said, though with less conviction than before. "They were dropped because witnesses suddenly became unavailable and evidence mysteriously disappeared," Sarah corrected. "But the investigation file is still open, and I happen to know some people who would be very interested in any new evidence of corruption or witness intimidation." The truth was that Sarah didn't have any specific knowledge of Richard Peterson's legal troubles, but her years of intelligence gathering had taught her how to read people and how to use their own fears against them. Derek's reaction told her everything she needed to know about his family's business practices and their vulnerability to scrutiny. "You're bluffing," Derek said, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried moments before. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts with deliberate slowness, letting Derek see names and numbers that meant nothing to him but carried the weight of authority in her voice. "Agent Martinez at the FBI Financial Crimes Division," she said, reading from her phone. "Agent Thompson at the DEA. They're always interested in how developers suddenly acquire large amounts of cash. And Detective Williams with the County Sheriff's Corruption Task Force." Each name hit Derek like a physical blow. His father's business operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal, using political connections and financial leverage to navigate around regulations that constrained his competitors. The last thing the Peterson family needed was renewed federal attention, especially from agencies that already had suspicions about their practices. "What do you want?" Derek asked, his bravado finally cracking completely. "I want you to understand something very important," Sarah said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Everything you just threatened to do to me, having me arrested on false charges, filing frivolous lawsuits, using your family's influence to destroy my life, constitutes criminal witness intimidation and conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law. These are federal crimes with serious prison sentences." Derek's friends had gone completely silent, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of the hole their leader had dug for all of them. What had started as a simple bar fight had escalated into something that could destroy their futures, and all because Derek couldn't handle being rejected by a woman. "More importantly," Sarah continued, "you need to understand who you're dealing with. My name is Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, United States Navy SEALs. I've spent the last 6 years serving my country in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. I've been shot at by terrorists, bombed by insurgents, and faced down enemies who would eat someone like you for breakfast." The revelation hit Derek and his friends like a physical force. Suddenly, everything made sense. Sarah's calm confidence, her professional fighting skills, her complete lack of intimidation in the face of their threats. They had tried to bully a Navy SEAL, someone trained to handle threats far more serious than drunk college students in a beach bar. "I've killed people in defense of this country," Sarah said, her voice matter-of-fact rather than boastful. "I've saved hostages from terrorist compounds, trained foreign allies in counter-terrorism tactics, and led missions that prevented attacks on American soil. Do you really think your daddy's money scares someone who has faced down armed extremists in hostile territory?" Derek's remaining defiance crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. The reality of his situation, that he had just assaulted a decorated military service member and then threatened to use his family's influence to retaliate against her, was beginning to penetrate even his alcohol-clouded judgment. "I didn't know," Derek mumbled, blood still dripping from his nose. "If I had known who you were, it shouldn't matter who I am," Sarah interrupted sharply. "You grabbed a woman without permission, threatened her when she said no, and then tried to intimidate her with your family's money when she defended herself. The fact that I happen to be trained to handle situations like this doesn't make your behavior any less despicable." The bar had fallen completely silent except for the sound of Derek's labored breathing and the distant crash of waves against the shore. Other patrons watched in fascination as a decorated war veteran delivered a lesson in respect and consequences to someone who had clearly never received either. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to giving orders that could mean the difference between life and death. "You and your friends are going to leave this bar immediately. You're going to seek medical attention for your injuries, which I sincerely hope will heal properly. And you're going to spend some serious time thinking about how you treat other people." Derek nodded weakly, no longer capable of maintaining eye contact. The transformation from swaggering bully to broken, humiliated young man was complete, and everyone present could see it. "If I ever hear of you laying hands on another woman, threatening someone with your family's influence, or using your father's money to hurt people who can't fight back, I will personally ensure that every law enforcement agency in the federal government takes a very close look at Peterson Development Group's business practices," Sarah continued. "And trust me, if there's anything illegal to find, they will find it." The threat hung in the air like a sword over Derek's head. His family's wealth and influence, which had been his shield and weapon throughout his life, suddenly felt like liabilities that could be turned against him by someone with the right connections and the will to use them. "Do we understand each other?" Sarah asked. "Yes," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry I didn't hear that," Sarah said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Yes, we understand each other," Derek said more clearly, though he still couldn't meet her eyes. Sarah studied him for a long moment, reading his body language for any signs of deception or continued defiance. Satisfied that the lesson had been thoroughly learned, she stepped back and gestured toward the door. "Then get out of here and don't come back." Derek's friends helped him to his feet, supporting him as they made their way toward the exit. The once proud group that had swaggered into the bar hours earlier now looked like beaten dogs, their tails between their legs, as they fled from a confrontation they had been foolish enough to start. As they reached the door, Derek turned back one last time, his face a mask of pain and humiliation. "This isn't over," he said, though the words carried no conviction. Sarah's response was swift and final. "Yes, it is, and if you're smart, you'll make sure it stays that way." The group disappeared into the night, leaving behind a bar full of stunned witnesses and a story that would be told and retold for years to come. Sarah returned to her seat at the bar, calmly finished her water, and left enough money on the counter to cover her drink and a generous tip for Miguel, who had watched the entire confrontation with wide-eyed amazement. As she prepared to leave, Miguel found his voice. "Miss, that was incredible. I've never seen anything like that." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she had shown all evening. Sometimes bullies need to learn that there are consequences for their actions. Hopefully, they'll remember this lesson. What none of them knew was that Derek Peterson's education in consequences was far from over. The revelation of Sarah's true identity had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape his understanding of power, privilege, and the price of using both unwisely. The emergency room at Coastal Regional Medical Center was buzzing with the typical Saturday night chaos when Derek Peterson and his friends stumbled through the automatic doors. Derek's broken nose had stopped bleeding, but his face was already beginning to swell, and his left eye was turning an impressive shade of purple. Brad walked gingerly, still feeling the effects of Sarah's precise strike to his liver, while the other three supported their injured friends with the shell-shocked expressions of people who had witnessed something that challenged their fundamental understanding of the world. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had been working emergency medicine for 15 years, long enough to recognize the signs of a bar fight from across the waiting room. What caught her attention, however, was the unusual nature of Derek's injuries. In her experience, broken noses from bar fights were usually accompanied by bruised knuckles, split lips, and the kind of scattered damage that came from prolonged, clumsy exchanges of punches. Derek's injuries, by contrast, were precise and professional, the kind of damage that suggested his attacker had known exactly what they were doing. "What happened here?" Dr. Walsh asked as she examined Derek's nose under the bright lights of the treatment room. "We got jumped," Derek mumbled through swollen lips, his voice distorted by the nasal injury. "Some crazy woman attacked us out of nowhere. Dr. Madison is out." Walsh raised an eyebrow but continued her examination without comment. She had heard enough fabricated stories over the years to recognize when someone wasn't telling the complete truth, but her job was to treat injuries, not investigate their causes. Derek's nose would require minor surgery to reset properly, and she recommended that he stay overnight for observation due to the possibility of a concussion. While Derek received medical treatment, his friends huddled in the waiting room, their earlier bravado replaced by a growing sense of dread. The reality of what had happened was beginning to sink in, along with the potential consequences of their actions. Tommy, who had been recording videos on his phone throughout the evening, made the mistake of checking his social media and discovered that someone else in the bar had captured the entire confrontation on video. "Oh no," Tommy whispered, staring at his phone screen. "Guys, we have a problem." The video, posted to multiple social media platforms with captions like "Navy SEAL destroys drunk bullies" and "When keeping it real goes wrong," was already going viral. The footage clearly showed Derek grabbing Sarah, her professional takedown of both Derek and Brad, and Derek's pathetic attempt to threaten her with his father's influence. Even worse, it included Sarah's revelation of her military service and her pointed remarks about the Peterson family's questionable business practices. Within hours, the video had been shared thousands of times, generating millions of views and an avalanche of comments. The vast majority of viewers sided overwhelmingly with Sarah, praising her restraint and professionalism while condemning Derek's behavior in terms that ranged from harsh criticism to calls for criminal prosecution. The hashtag #NavySealJustice began trending nationally, with veterans organizations and women's rights groups sharing the video as an example of how to handle harassment and assault. By Sunday morning, the story had been picked up by local news outlets, and by Monday, it was making national headlines. Entitled "Rich Kid Learns Hard Lesson from Navy SEAL" became the dominant narrative, with news organizations digging into Derek's background and discovering a pattern of similar incidents throughout his college career. Former classmates came forward with stories of Derek's aggressive behavior toward women, his use of his father's influence to escape consequences, and his general attitude that rules didn't apply to him. The scrutiny quickly expanded to include Richard Peterson and his business empire. Investigative journalists, armed with Sarah's hints about FBI investigations and corruption allegations, began looking into Peterson Development Group's practices with renewed interest. They discovered a web of questionable deals, suspiciously timed political contributions, and development projects that had proceeded despite significant environmental and zoning concerns. The FBI, which had indeed maintained an open file on Richard Peterson despite the dropped charges, found itself under public pressure to reopen its investigation. Agent Rebecca Martinez, no relation to Sarah, who had led the original investigation, received dozens of calls from reporters asking about the Peterson family's legal troubles. While she couldn't comment on ongoing investigations, the renewed attention provided the justification her superiors needed to authorize a fresh look at the evidence. For Derek, the aftermath of the bar fight became a nightmare that seemed to grow worse with each passing day. The video of his humiliation had been viewed by millions of people, including potential employers, college administrators, and everyone he had ever known. His reputation, built on a foundation of inherited privilege and manufactured toughness, was destroyed overnight. The university where Derek was pursuing his graduate degree in business administration launched its own investigation after the video surfaced. The administration was particularly concerned about his pattern of aggressive behavior toward women and his apparent belief that his father's money could buy his way out of any situation. After reviewing the evidence, including testimony from several female students who had previously been afraid to speak out, the university made the decision to expel Derek for violating the student code of conduct. Derek's internship at a prestigious investment firm was terminated immediately after the video went viral. The firm's partners, horrified by the potential damage to their reputation, issued a public statement condemning Derek's behavior and emphasizing their commitment to workplace equality and respect. Similar rejections followed from every other company where Derek had pending job applications, as employers decided that associating with him was simply too risky. The legal consequences were equally severe. Sarah, after consulting with military legal advisors, decided to press assault charges against Derek for the initial unwanted touching and subsequent attack. The video evidence made the case straightforward, and Derek's own recorded threats about using his family's influence to retaliate against her added additional federal charges for attempted witness intimidation. Derek's father hired the most expensive criminal defense attorney money could buy, but even skilled legal representation couldn't overcome video evidence and a dozen witnesses. The attorney's main strategy was to negotiate a plea deal that would minimize jail time in exchange for Derek accepting responsibility for his actions and agreeing to extensive community service and anger management counseling. The federal investigation into Peterson Development Group proceeded with methodical precision. Armed with new subpoena power and renewed political support, investigators uncovered a pattern of corruption that stretched back more than a decade. Phone records revealed conversations between Richard Peterson and city council members about zoning changes that benefited his projects. Bank records showed suspicious patterns of cash deposits that coincided with favorable municipal decisions. Former employees, emboldened by the public scrutiny, came forward with testimony about bribes, kickbacks, and intimidation tactics. The investigation revealed that Richard Peterson had built his empire not through legitimate business acumen, but through a systematic corruption of the local political process. His developments had proceeded despite environmental concerns that should have blocked them. His projects had received tax incentives they didn't qualify for, and his companies had been awarded municipal contracts through rigged bidding processes. As the walls closed in around the Peterson family empire, Richard Peterson found himself facing the kind of consequences he had spent decades avoiding. The federal prosecutors filed charges including conspiracy, bribery, tax evasion, and racketeering under the RICO Act. The charges carried potential prison sentences that would effectively end his career and destroy his family's wealth. The psychological impact on Derek was perhaps more devastating than the legal consequences. His entire identity had been built around being the son of a powerful, successful businessman, someone who commanded respect through wealth and influence. The revelation that his father's success was built on corruption and crime shattered Derek's understanding of himself and his place in the world. For the first time in his life, Derek was forced to confront the reality of his own actions without the safety net of his father's money and influence. The video of his humiliation played endlessly in his mind, along with Sarah's words about consequences and respect. The memory of being so completely dominated by someone he had underestimated became a constant source of shame and self-reflection. In the quiet moments between court appearances and therapy sessions, Derek began to understand something that his privileged upbringing had never taught him. That respect couldn't be bought or inherited, that real strength had nothing to do with intimidation or violence, and that the way you treated other people was the true measure of your character. The transformation was gradual and often painful. Derek had to unlearn decades of entitled thinking, confront his own capacity for cruelty and selfishness, and build a new understanding of what it meant to be a decent human being. The process was complicated by the fact that everyone around him, former friends, potential employers, even strangers on the street, knew exactly who he was and what he had done. Sarah Martinez, meanwhile, had returned to her military duties, largely unaware of the tsunami of consequences her revelation had set in motion. She had hoped that Derek would learn from their encounter, but she never expected it to become a national story or trigger a federal investigation. When military public affairs officers briefed her on the media attention, she was surprised by the overwhelmingly positive response from the public. Veterans organizations praised her professionalism and restraint under pressure. Women's rights groups used her example to highlight the importance of self-defense training and standing up to harassment. Military recruiting officers reported increased interest from young women inspired by her example. Sarah found herself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as a symbol of strong, capable women who refused to be intimidated. The story's impact extended far beyond Derek's personal consequences. It sparked national conversations about privilege, accountability, and the difference between justice and revenge. Sarah's measured response to Derek's aggression, using precisely the amount of force necessary to stop the threat without causing unnecessary harm, became a textbook example of professional self-defense. Law enforcement agencies began using the video as a training tool, demonstrating how to de-escalate situations while maintaining the ability to respond to violence when necessary. Military instructors incorporated Sarah's example into their curriculum on rules of engagement and proportional response. Even civilian self-defense courses adopted her techniques as models of effective, controlled defensive action. 6 months after that fateful night in the beach bar, Derek Peterson stood in a federal courthouse, waiting to learn his sentence for assault and attempted witness intimidation. His father stood in a different courtroom across town, facing his own federal charges. The Peterson Development Group had been dissolved, its assets frozen pending the outcome of the criminal cases. Derek had spent those 6 months in intensive therapy, working to understand the root causes of his aggressive behavior and entitled attitude. The process had been humbling and often painful, forcing him to confront ugly truths about himself that he had spent years avoiding. But for the first time in his life, Derek was beginning to understand what it meant to take genuine responsibility for his actions. The judge, after reviewing Derek's case file and hearing testimony about his efforts at rehabilitation, sentenced him to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and 2,000 hours of community service. The sentence was harsh but fair, reflecting both the seriousness of his crimes and his apparent commitment to change. As Derek was led away in handcuffs, he thought about the woman who had changed his life in the space of a few minutes. He had never spoken to Sarah Martinez again after that night in the bar, but he thought about her often. Not with anger or resentment, as he might have in the past, but with a grudging respect for someone who had shown him exactly what real strength looked like. Sarah Martinez had returned to her SEAL team and the demanding life of special operations, but the impact of her actions continued to ripple outward. The story became a legend in military circles, a perfect example of how training, professionalism, and moral courage could triumph over bullying and privilege. Derek Peterson had thought he could intimidate her, use his size and numbers and family connections to force her into submission. Instead, he had learned a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. That real power comes not from wealth or privilege or the ability to hurt others, but from the strength to stand up for what's right, even when you're outnumbered and alone. It was a lesson that came at an enormous cost, but for Derek Peterson, it might have been the most valuable education he had ever received.